Hello, I'm Craig Constantine. I'm here today with Jule Kucera. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about creating space. Or how did you put that?
Protecting the safety of our guest?
Yeah, and it's right up against like the moral responsibility or the ethical responsibility that we, as the global royal we, have as hosts or interviewers. So, you and I talked a little bit beforehand and we exchanged a couple of messages. So, I'm just wondering if you can tell me a little bit about you mentioned you had a bit of an aha moment where you sort of found your guiding touch point or guiding star for how you think about this now. So, can you tell me about that?
Sure. And the like most aha moments, it comes after a problem, right? You're like, uh-oh, now what? So the aha was I was interviewing somebody, and during the conversation, I was thinking, I don't know if I should be asking these, like, it was starting to feel too personal,
Hmm.
but I didn't have a good sense of any guidelines for myself. And then in the edit, I ended up cutting out about a good 10 minutes of it because it just felt too raw. And then I finished the edit because, you got to get to post and I'm still learning and I'm
Right.
behind. But then I went online and said, I got to figure out, is there any guidance around this? And I came across an interview. It was part of a workshop that was done for not-for-profit organizations. It wasn't done for podcasters, but there are lessons fit for podcasters really well because they were talking about ethical storytelling. And the
Hmm.
two interview or the two people talking, one was a former interviewer with or host with NPR, and the other one was formerly with the BBC. So they got
Hmm.
cred.
Right.
And I don't remember if they specifically called out these 2 points or they were the two that I took away. And I'll put this link in the episode, Craig. But the two things that I took away from it were one, make sure the guest has agency in the conversation. And two, do not engage in trauma porn. And they use the term trauma porn, which is something not for profits do to raise funds as they kind of,
Right.
parade the person who's been helped by the organization and they tell the gory details of their story. And it's more exploitative than helpful.
Hmm. Um, the person that you had interviewed and then you felt some trepidation when you went to do the edit, did you know them in advance? Like, do you think this problem is I feel like it would be made better if you know the person that you're talking to, but I'm actually wondering if maybe in reality it might be worse when I know the person because I can actually manipulate them like in a bad way because I have a more subtle understanding of the situation. I'm just wondering if you've had any chance to reflect on how does this, let's call it a responsibility, how does this responsibility play out, what we'll call a cold guest versus a guest that you know really well?
That's a really great question. And I've had it play out in both instances with
Hmm.
guests, because the guest it happened with was someone I was acquainted with but didn't really know well. And frequently on my podcast, I don't know what the person's going to talk about. Even if I've known the person for 10 years, they can
Hmm.
still surprise me. So what I'm asking myself is it cold guest versus warm guest, or guest where I know the story versus warm guest where I know the story versus I don't know the story? I'm
Story.
still thinking about that, but it's happened a number of times. And so I have guardrails now that have helped me both in the conversation and in the edit.
Hmm. So, well, now that begs the question: what are these guardrails?
What are the guardrails? My guardrails, it's just a motto, which is vulnerability is okay, nakedness is not.
That's a good guardrail.
Vulnerability is okay, nakedness is not. And I do recognize that it's subjective. Do I feel that the guest is naked? And I could be off or not. But because of the nature of my podcast, when I've edited the episode, I send it to the guest for their approval, and I tell them anything you don't want in
Hmm.
there, I'll cut out. And so far, nobody's ever asked me to cut anything out.
Hmm.
But I can. One of my favorite examples that I think really helps support the value of having a motto was when I was talking to somebody, and then in the edit, they had done a they had worked hard to control whether or not they cried, and because I don't
Right.
try to make people cry. Sometimes it just happens. And this person did not want to cry, but they had said something very difficult that I didn't notice in the conversation, but in the edit I heard they made a sound, and it was like a combination of a gasp or a sob. It was just, there was so much aching pain in that 1/2 second sound that I
Hmm.
cut it out. And I feel that that was the right thing to do, because to me, that was naked. That was beyond vulnerable.
That's an interesting point, or an interesting thing for you to bring up, that we started by saying, you and I, the hypothesis here is that we have a responsibility to create the space and to protect the guest. And one of the first things I think of is like, well, wait, well, how did I get stuck with this responsibility? And one obvious place is I chose to press record and point mics at people. But another place that I'm thinking this comes from is, we're wielding the magical power, whether or not we involve them later, we're still wielding this power of the editorial, the choice of what's in and what's out. And a lot of times I know I've always thought of that editorial as, well, yeah, I'm the artist. I mean, with great responsibility, blah, blah, but
Mm-hmm.
I've never really thought before about, yeah, that, okay, I'm only going to use it for good, but still, even if I'm only using it for good, it's a very powerful, scalpel's not quite the right metaphor, but it's a very powerful tool. And I think the point you're making about, yeah, it's one thing to like know what you're doing, to have thought about the meta of your trade. And it's another thing to go into the interview with the right mindset and, okay, I have my guardrails, I have my way I do things, and here's what I'm trying to get. I want this, not that, vulnerable, not naked. And then it's another to think about that in post.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I haven't, um, I've only had, uh, yeah, too many conversations to enumerate, but only in a small number of times has the conversation gone somewhere where I'm like, whoa, this is vulnerable or very personal. Most of the
Mm-hmm.
times I don't wind up in those spaces, just not because I don't go there, but just doesn't seem to go there. Um, and I hadn't really considered, well, I could have cut out that really, I don't want to say awkward, but I could have maybe cut down the emotional, and I could have dialed it from 10 down to 9 by just a couple little simple snips. So I think that's a really astute observation to make on your part. Thank you.
You're welcome. It happened because I was a guest on an interview on a podcast, and I was telling the story of when my husband passed. And I can tell that story pretty easily without crying. It's been a long time. But the host was asking some questions that were really digging. And at one point, I wanted water. And even though I had some right by my side, I said, I want to go get some water. Because essentially, I just wanted some space from the conversations. I walked away, got some water, came back, or got a glass of water, came back and said, hang on, drank the water with my headset on.
Mm,
And the decision was made to leave that in the recording of, the me gulping water. And that's an instance where, and I did reach out to the person, and we just had a different perspective on whether that was beyond vulnerable. Um, and so that's what's made me maybe extra careful about it, because
mm.
the nature of my podcast is kind of touchy, kind of vulnerable. But I do like your perspective that it's in post. I mean, we're interviewing our guest and they're telling our story, but when it goes through our hands in post, we're telling the story.
Yeah, and as much as my shtick is not like powering my podcast with storytelling per se. I'm not trying to actually create an arc. I certainly don't create one in post production. Um, but it's two or three or four, it's some number of humans talking. We're telling stories. That's how humans communicate. So
Yeah.
it does wind up being storytelling, and even the slightest, um, I'm just thinking, sometimes people, I cheat. We don't do the actual final editing in house. We use outside services,
Yeah.
but we do review very carefully what they send back, because sometimes
Mm-hmm.
we have, cut this or cut that or whatever. I can't recall ever rearranging anything that's ever been said, other than to like take a pull highlight out to the front, as a cold open kind of thing. Um, but I was just thinking, if I haven't lost my train of thought, um, I was going to say, even the slightest changes in post production make a big difference. So sometimes they send them back, and it's like it's tight, like all the space is
Too
gone,
tight.
yeah. And it's
Yeah.
like, I'm like, what happened to this? Like the whole tone feels different. So there's,
Mm-hmm.
even if you don't go in and decide this 10, one doesn't go in and say this 10 minutes is too personal, to protect the, to
Mm-hmm.
be honest, as the host, I'm going to take that out. Even if you're just making small things, if you remove, just go in and take all the ums, ahs, and breaths out on your side and leave them all in on their side. Well, now
Yeah.
that's a whole different, that's not what we recorded.
Yeah.
Um,
And just think and comparatively how much better you will sound than they will sound simply because you did that.
right. Um, I really, I'm super passionate about, and I'm just like, I'm not a big fan of the word passionate because I use the daylights out of it, but I'm super passionate about conversation as like a method for improving myself. Like I think conversing with other people, especially when I have no clue what we're going to be talking about, is a really good way to get better at listening and empathizing and all those things.
That's true. The studies have shown.
Yeah, and what is it? And that's the mirror neurons. I think it is there's a whole physiological part of us. But
Mm-hmm.
where I was going to go with that is, uh, I go to tremendous lengths. I do the Movers Mindset podcast, which is my main project. I do that one in person. And that's like a whole nother level of hurt is to actually go and record in the field.
Yeah.
And then, but I've been in places where I've considered buying a coffee table because I was going to be in a flat, for a week doing interviews. And I'm like, but there's no table in the middle of the room. And I'm like, all right, I'm not going to go to IKEA, even though it wouldn't cost much. I don't own the place. I had to leave it here. But I really think that anything you can do before you press record, is what people think of. Like we as podcasters, as hosts, we think, I'm going to do my homework. Everybody has their style, write questions out, don't write your novel. I'm going to do my prep work. I'm going to do my thing. I'm going to make the guests feel comfortable. And then in the very beginning, when you press record, you're as nervous as the guest is. Once you get past that phase, when you press record, I think a lot of podcasters I've seen, they switch from this super beneficent, is that a word?
Yeah, I
Super,
think so. Beneficent?
super, where like everything I do for you, dear guest, like in an honest way, right?
Yeah.
They switch to like, okay, but now I can't worry about you, like, because oh my God, I'm podcasting and I can't say so. And it's really tough, I think, to go across that, the moment of pressing record, to get across that moment of record and still have the same mindset of,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of Google's do no evil, like to make it
Yeah.
across record and still 15 minutes in be thinking, I'm still 100% all in on safe space,
Mm-hmm.
making the guests feel welcome, trying to figure out, like, are they sweating profusely? Maybe I need to, conceptually back off, or maybe physically back off. Maybe I'm talking to somebody who has a different personality. So there's so much there to unpack about,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as one practices.
Yeah. When I used to think I was focused on pressing record to get the guest past it, so I do it early in our conversation. I really think it's as much to get me past it.
Hmm. It is a weird moment,
Mm-hmm.
because for both the host and the guest, everybody is cognizant that nothing before record is ever going to get heard. Like after record, you could get edited out, but before record, nobody hears that. It's like things get real when the little red light comes on. And I try to remind myself of that, having done whatever hundreds, I don't get nervous anymore when people press record on either side. I'm just like, hey, whatever. Like if I was nervous about this, I shouldn't be here at all, kind of thing. But I always try to remember, like the very first recording I ever tried to do with somebody that I screwed up. I didn't press record, and 13 minutes in, I went, "Oh, hey, remember when I said I needed a guinea pig because I was going to screw it up? I screwed it up." So I always try to remember, like what is it like to be sitting in the chair, for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody that I've ever talked to, in podcasting circles, all the podcasters I've talked to, they've always been nice human, nice people. They're in it
Really
for the right
nice
reason.
people. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. They're the podcasters that I know are motivated by something. There's something they want to get out into the world. It can
mm.
be a topic. It can be, I mean, if you think about Greg, you've been involved with every pod, right? Every pod, 1, 2, 3, 4. You were in
No, I
one,
didn't.
and
I was only in the Akimbo courses. I took 3, but I had a podcast for, I'd have to do math, like 2 or 3 years before that.
mm,
So I took 3, and then I've been back to help for 4, 5, 6, 7,
7,
8.
8.
I don't know
Yeah.
what number are we on.
Yeah. You're heading into 9. And you think about how many podcasts you've seen come
Yes.
through, and they're all so different. That's what
Yes.
amazes me. Every podcaster has a motivation that's unique and special, and I'm just happy that they're we're doing this, and that it's yes, there are costs to it, but I love how Seth Godin says the tools of production are in our hands.
Yes.
This is like
Yes.
having our own radio show.
Yes.
You
Yeah,
know,
it doesn't have to cost. Well, you can actually figure out how to do the hosting basically for free too if you're really motivated. But roughly like $15 a month total will get you, going. You can buy used gear off eBay. It really is low barrier to entry. But of course, the other side of that is it's very I don't know, like it's real. Like when
mm-hmm.
you press record, people I hear people's interviews that I recorded that are like 3 or 4 years old, and I'm like, wow, that person is not the same person anymore. Not like the interview was bad or showed bad things, but wow, has that person changed in 3 years? And I'm thinking like, this stuff's it's pretty permanent. I mean, you can delete it out of your podcast feed, but the Internet Archive found it and Google found it, and so it is a very it pretty much chiseled in stone as far as anything goes on the internet. It's a really permanent type of performance, and it never ceases to amaze me that guests will sit and be like, "Yeah, I'm down for that." I'm like, "Okay," like
Right.
another person.
Here we go. Yeah,
Yeah.
you really
So
want to? Yay! Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing to me to think that I'll be off the planet, but my voice and the voice of my guests will still
Yep.
be here.
Yep.
And I
Yeah.
love knowing that. I love what Bruce Devereaux is doing with the Creatively Engaging in his
Yes.
podcast. He's capturing voices that are so close to disappearing.
Hmm.
They don't have a lot of time, and he's capturing them.
Yeah. It's an interesting. Yeah. Um. What else springs to mind?
I would say that I've I've talked about what I wanted to talk about, so I'm happy to close if you want. As long as the message that I would want people to take away from this is, as the host, you have a responsibility, not just to your audience, but to your guest, and that responsibility resides within the context of the conversation and afterward. And just be ethical. Especially if you have conversations that tend to go into vulnerable areas, make sure you have a guardrail for yourself that will help guide you when you're in the conversation or in the edit.
Hmm. That's a terrific observation, a terrific piece of advice, and I think a terrific place to stop.
I think so
Um,
too, Craig.
Cool. Thank
All
you
right.
very much, Jule. It's a pleasure. I don't think we've had a chance to talk while recording previously. I know we've talked before, but it's fun to get a chance to actually create something together.
Yeah, we've been on webinars together, Zoom calls together, but yeah, this is
So,
fun.
thanks.
We made it.
And now we'll just press stop.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jule. Bye.
Bye, Craig.